Welcome back to Paleo Talks. We were off last week, but here we are again. And this week we have researcher Dr. Jenny McGuire from Georgia Tech. How you doing, Jenny?
Doing well. How are you?
We're doing all right. We're hanging in there over here in Tennessee. And along with me today is David Moscato, as usual. Josh Samuels joining us again, and as usual as well, Dr. Chris Widga. And we usually move over to David right now, and he tells us a little bit more about how the show works for those that are new.
That's right. We're going to do the same format as usual. We're going to start here in just a moment with our guest giving their presentation today about Paleo-Dynamics, which should be very fun. At about the halfway point of the program, so half an hour or so from now, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience so that the later part of the presentation is going to be all audience Q&A. So we'll remind you at that point to go ahead and put your questions in the comments of the Facebook video, and we'll start collecting and reading those out then. And as always, if for any reason you can't leave a comment on the Facebook video, you can head over to the Gray Fossil site on Twitter or Instagram and send us a message or a tweet or whatever you want there, and I'll be keeping an eye on that as well.
David, you are continually so optimistic that we will be done in 30 minutes and ready to start moving over to the questions.
I am. I keep saying, and I always think, half an hour-ish. We'll see what happens.
My talk is 30 minutes. We just have to keep this very short.
Right. We typically interrupt you some, so.
At some point between half an hour and an hour, we will open it up to questions from the audience.
All right, well, again, welcome. I'm Blaine Schubert, and we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology, Johnson City, Tennessee, East Tennessee State University, which is known for the Gray Fossil site and our paleontology program. And we're continuing this series. I think we might be on episode 39, if I'm remembering correctly. Yep, David's nodding. Right. So moving right along in all of these episodes. And what we like to do as we start, Jenny, is to have you tell us a little bit more about your background in paleontology and how you ended up in the position that you're at. So what universities you went to, what sparked your interest originally, and then your position that you're currently at. If you could go over a little bit of that and then move into sharing your presentation with us.
All right, great. So I started off, let's see, I did my undergraduate, I guess, at Duke University. And there I double majored in two departments that now have different names, biological anthropology and anatomy, which is now evolutionary anthropology, and earth and ocean sciences, which is now part of the Nicholas School. And so I was really interested in evolution and evolution of intelligence, particularly, looking at anthropology. I did some field work. I did a field program in South Africa, and I also did a field program for my geology degree in Montana. It was super cool. And around the time when I went to South Africa, it was exciting, digging for human ancestors and whatever. But there are very few specimens of those, And while we were there, I was looking and I was like, well, look at how many other fossils that are being dug up, and like, how cool would it be to understand like how those evolved like gradually through time. And so I decided to go into pure paleontology for my PhD. So I took a couple of years off and figured out exactly kind of the field that I wanted to study. I was still, even as a kid, all growing up, I was very passionate about conservation. So I wanted to kind of stay relevant, ask interesting questions. And I decided one of the things that I really was excited about was having large sample sizes. And you'll see that reflected a bit in my talk. So I ended up going to Berkeley as a PhD. For my PhD, I worked with Tony Barnowski there. And I studied kind of intraspecific variation, microevolution in rodent species. And since then, I did two postdocs. So one at the National Evolutionary Synthesis Center, where I was looking at Paleo-Dynamics, range changes in species through time. And then I wanted to figure out how to integrate better my research with questions in conservation biology. And I took a postdoc at University of Washington with Josh Lawler, which is the Landscape Ecology, Conservation and Landscape Ecology Lab, is that what it's called? And there I did, a lot of like pure landscape ecology, conservation biology, and really, learned about the questions that are being asked in conservation today. And, going forward, as I've become a faculty member, became an assistant professor at Georgia Tech in 2017. So I'm a couple of years in, but I've really been focusing on finding strategies to integrate our fields and really think about the important questions in conservation biology and how can we use historical data in order to address some of those questions. And I'll talk about that a little bit in my talk. So
thank you. Yeah, this is, it's so fascinating, this subfield of paleontology and this bringing together of paleontological research with sort of how the future might look and how organisms move their distributions. And so, yeah, we're really looking forward to hearing your work today.
Awesome. So should I
get
started?
Go ahead and start your presentation.
Still an extra minute. All right, let me make sure. Tell me if I've shared the wrong screen again.
Nope, that's it.
All right, full presentation?
Yep, looks good.
All right, great. So I am going to start off with finding my slide presenter, so I don't have to stand here, by talking about where we are right now today. So we are not yet at a sixth mass extinction, but we are rapidly approaching a sixth mass extinction. So if we look back at the previous 5 mass extinctions, they're defined by 75% of species having gone extinct. And if you look at the bottom part of this graph, you can see that we're not there yet. So recently extinct species, we're not anywhere close to that mark. If all of the species that are threatened today go extinct, we're starting to approach that mark. But the reality is that the rates of extinction are in fact right in line for us to hit that 75% extinction mark in the next several hundred years if we continue at the rate that we're going. And species that are alive today, in fact, this is what they have experienced thus far, they are about to experience incredibly rapid climate change, as we all know, right? And we also know that population sizes are growing, human impacts are expanding rapidly on the landscape. This is a time series of Las Vegas from 1984 up until today. And you can see how dramatically the footprint of just this city has expanded over that 40-year time period. And so we anticipate that in response to this change in climate, species are going to need to shift their ranges in order to adapt to changing climates. And so this is a map that shows you how we expect amphibian species in yellow, mammal species in pink, and bird species in blue to need to shift their ranges on the landscape if they are to track the climates in which they're currently living. But when we look at this map, this is kind of the perspective that conservation biologists often take of like, these are the needs of species going forward, considering the fact that climate is changing. So this is a really dynamic perspective on how species might be expected to move. But the reality is that we don't, in fact, actually know the extent to which organisms track climate with extreme fidelity. And we also don't know the extent to which organisms are hindered by human activity on the landscape. So this is a map of the continental United States. And what you can see here is that much of the landscape all of the yellow portion, has been modified by humans. And so like 75% of the land area has been modified by human land uses. So in conservation and thinking about biodiversity and how biodiversity is going to respond to changing climate, we have a couple of really important challenges. We have things that are going to need to shift across large spatial scales. We know that climate is changing incredibly rapidly and with really large magnitudes of change. And we also know that land use change is continuing to shift, continuing to change. And the footprint of humans on the landscape is expanding quite a bit. So how can a conservation biologist try to get a grasp on what's anticipated to happen going forward? If you use a 5, a 10, a 50-year time span and try to look back at how things have been responding recently, it's still not a significant enough in magnitude change in order to understand these really large scale responses. And so what we've been doing in my lab is trying to take some of these hypotheses and approaches from spatial ecology and conservation biology and integrate them with some of the insights and perspectives that we gain from late Quaternary paleontology to inform this field, the subfield known as conservation paleontology. And I'm just going to take a few minutes to show you how and why this works, right? So the nice thing about the paleontological record is that we can look over deeper time spans that can represent kind of the magnitudes of change that we're seeing today. So, if we look back in the past, and I'll just orient you to this and then I'll walk through a few, we know that the amount of available land and the climate have both changed through time. So on the bottom left, you're seeing the climate during the Oligocene, 34 to 23 million years ago. And then on the right in the map, you can see that North America had a very different shape than it does today, right? And these changes have occurred over long time spans, but even over very short time spans. So here we are at the Pleistocene, and we have quite rapid and quite dramatic shifts in climate. And we also have deglaciation that changes the amount of available land for species over time. So I'm going to make the argument that conservation paleontology is and can be a big data field. So this is a map from the Neotoma database, and I'm just going to give you guys the example of Natural Trap Cave. And it's not actually in the Neotoma database yet. We're working on it. It'll be there soon. But this is a picture of Natural Trap Cave, and it has fossils from at least 30,000 years to the modern. And if you guys want to hear more about it, episode 16 in this series by Julie Meechan featured Natural Trap Cave and talked a lot about some of the different pieces of history of Natural Trap Cave. She talked a lot about ancient DNA and the megafauna at Natural Trap Cave. And that's some of the many pieces of Natural Trap Cave. I'm going to tell you just about the microfauna, which is kind of my piece of this puzzle in Natural Trap Cave. And it's in the top left corner of this little puzzle. So if you think about these microfauna that are present at Natural Trap Cave, there's tens of thousands of these vertebrate fossils. There's so many of these fossils that we, like, every week for the last, pre-pandemic, every week for the past, 5 years or so, we've hosted these Fossil Friday events where we have dozens of volunteers picking through fossils and picking out lots of tiny, tiny fossils, so that we now have tens of thousands of small identifiable vertebrate fossils. And with these, we're able to reconstruct small vertebrate communities over the past 30,000 years. So we're able to address questions like, okay, when we had the severe drought around 4,000 years ago in North America, how did communities of small vertebrates respond? Did small mammal species end up increasing in abundance relative to some of the larger small mammal species? Or did more generalists versus more dietary specialists end up dominating the communities at that time period? And this is really important and relevant for places like California that are anticipated to have really extreme long-term droughts going forward, right? And so if you think, this is just an example from Natural Trap Cave, small vertebrate communities, 30,000 years, so much data. Neotoma database has over 15,000 sites, and each of these sites has its own observations. There's over 4 million observations in these databases. And these sites and these data, it's three-dimensional. So we have where species are living, what is the climate at each different site through different time periods. And so integrating this fossil and these spatial data is a really powerful approach. So you can look at how climates and landscapes have shifted over time and how this might interact with where we're in fact seeing the individual species living on that landscape. And so that's why we've named our lab Spatial Ecology and Paleontology Lab. This is what we study, is this three dimensions of how species and climates and landscapes have shifted over time. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of different questions that we've been thinking about related to spatial and environmental dynamics and how they drive species ranges. First, I'm going to talk about how rapidly the plant biomes, which are the foundation of any ecosystem, how rapidly do they in fact transition when climates change? And then we're going to shift and think about whether or not species are in fact going to be able to track changes, track climates as they change. So what's the extent to which things respond to climate change, and can they in fact track climate if they're needing to respond? So for this first question, I'm going to introduce Yue Wang, who is a postdoc in my lab, and she's been working on this question. We just published a paper in Global Change Biology on this, so if you're interested, email me. I'm happy to send you a copy of it. She looked at this question using, like I said, the incredible fossil pollen record from North America. So here's 358 core sites from across North America. This is from 20,000 years ago until about 100 years ago, till the present approximately. And each one of these sites looks like this, right? So this is a sediment core, and the sediment core is vertical from top to bottom. And then each one of those little red lines is a pollen sample. We have over 14,000 pollen samples. And what someone, not me, has gone through and done is counted all of those pollen granules and figured out the relative number of let's say, pine pollen to oak pollen within those pollen samples. And so we can use these in order to calculate how the relative abundances of pollen, which you can translate to plants, has changed over time. And so what we did was we took each of those pollen samples and we compared it to pollen from a known modern sample, a modern sample where we know what is the habitat that this pollen sample is collected in. And we determined which biome each of these pollen samples looked most like. And so here's an example of what a biome might be. It could be a pine forest, or a deciduous forest, or a prairie, which is a grassland, or a desert, right? So this is the type of thing, how coarse of a habitat we're looking at. We also had a couple of plant biomes included that are no analog. That means that they're more prevalent in the past than they are today. So what we're asking here is, how long does a biome persist before it transitions to a different biome? So how long might this forest last or persist in a single place before it switches over to a grassland? And here's how we measured this. We calculated the residence time of these biomes. So here again, you see a core on the left. We've identified each of the samples to what kind of biome it represents. And so this Deciduous forest, this is how long, this is the resonance time of the deciduous forest most recently. For prairies, we would say, okay, what's the length of time that the prairies persisted, and calculate the resonance time. And then for the deciduous forest, again, we would have a second resonance time for this core. And so what we ended up finding was that North American plant biomes transition about every 460 years. This is median time. But if you look at forest versus grass and shrublands, forests, of course, transition much more slowly. They persist for longer, on the order of 700 years, whereas grass and shrublands transition more on the order of every 340 years. And so if we then take this information and say, okay, what does this look like through time? What is the pattern of how long these biomes persist, or how rapidly they transition across all of these different events that have happened over the past 20,000 years? Here's the picture that we see. So we see that on this graph, the resonance time, if it's high, that means it's lasting for a very long time. So things are very stable, and like the forest is persisting for a very long time. And if it's on the toward the bottom of the graph, that means it's transitioning quite rapidly. And so if we look at human arrival, approximately here, we can see that plant biomes were already transitioning pretty quickly before humans arrived in North America. This also preceded the megafauna extinction. We already are having this pretty rapid turnover happening here. And it looks like this rapid turnover started more in line when we start having glacial retreat across North America. So this kind of rapid turnover and potential destabilization of the ecosystems very likely preceded megafaunal extinctions here in North America. If we look at that with respect to the temperatures and precipitations that we're seeing in North America at each of these sites, what we end up finding is that the rate of temperature change is strongly related to residence time. So as soon as temperature starts changing rapidly, plant biomes start turning over rapidly. And in fact, what we see is that they're turning over and they're shifting. What's happening is they're shifting across the landscape over time, except recently. So we don't see a lot of temperature change over the most recent time periods. But starting about 4,000 years ago, we again have this really steep downturn in residence times. And it's looking like this is corresponding when we start having agricultural and population booms of Native Americans on the landscape by looking at the archaeological record, potentially. So what do we learn from plant biomes? We see that they're transitioning rapidly as climate is changing. And these transitions, in fact, and many people have seen this, are translating to rapid shifts across the landscape. And we can look at individual biomes and individual taxa and see which ones are shifting most rapidly and responding most rapidly to climate change. The answer ends up being forests respond more slowly and grasslands respond more rapidly, right?
Penny, I have a quick question. So how does this differ with these plant biomes in an area, comparing two different areas, one with a vast amount of space with low topographic change versus a mountainous area?
That's a great question. We looked at that really hard,
Okay.
and we found very little signal. So we found no latitudinal gradient. We've found no elevational diversity gradient. And so
living in an area with greater elevational differences doesn't necessarily help you?
No,
As a species?
it's not. I mean, not in this, not looking at these data. We have some ideas for how and why that might change. So it's possible that there's these very frequent transitions between things that are kind of expected, like deciduous forest and grassland, right? And that's this local shift back and forth. And that might be, so we're starting to like combine some of the biomes and combine some of the transitions and look to see whether or not some of these very natural types of transitions are masking some of the signal of some of the more directional and or more dynamic transitions. So Stay
Thank you.
tuned. We'll see. Yeah, good question. All right, so now I'm going to tell you about, okay, if things are needing to shift rapidly across the landscape, are they actually going to be able to track habitable climates as they change? And this goes back to this figure, you know, and we're switching over now to think about mammal species and wonder whether or not these mammal species are in fact going to be able to track these habitats and these climates as they're shifting on the landscape, and as you know, as they potentially need to, according to this figure. And so this is some previous work that I did, and what it shows that if you just consider the spatial configuration of where natural areas are located, what you end up seeing is that human impacted landscapes, so habitat fragmentation, could be limiting the ability of species living in those natural areas from tracking climate in up to 24% of natural areas. So all of the areas that are red here are areas that are limiting, where the climate tracking of the taxa living there are limited because of the fact that it's hard for those species to move up into some of the cooler areas. But the question is, you know, is this a reality, right? So to what extent are different animals actually influenced or actually inhibited by human impacts on the landscape? And so, you know, if a bear was living in one of these little red areas, is it actually limited by the fact that there's a giant highway here or a giant agricultural field here? You know, to what extent are those things inhibiting things from moving and shifting on the landscape? So this is a question that another postdoc of mine, Sylvia Pineda-Munoz, tackled during her time with me. And also she just published this paper in PNAS this January. So again, if you're interested in learning more, email me, I'll send you the paper. So what she did to approach this is she looked at the fossil record to see what are the climates where mammals have lived through time. And so she looked at this going back to 12,000 years ago, and I'll show you this map, this figure. What this is showing you is that she looked at this question across the Holocene. And the reason for this is because, as you can see here, the climate is relatively stable over this time period, right? And that's what you're seeing with the red and the blue. Up until the most recent times, you can see the upturn in temperature on the rightmost side of this figure. And she divided up the times into time periods that were relevant to kind of the human timeline within North America. So there's a post-glacial time period from 11,700 years ago to 4,200 years before present. We have an agricultural period from 4,200 years to 1500 AD. European arrival, right, 1500 to 1850. And then we have an industrial period, 1850 to 1950, and the present, 1950 to the present. So she looked at what are the climates where each of these, where 46 different North American mammal species were living during each of these 5 time periods. And it's pretty well distributed across different types of mammals, from artiodactyls to rodents to rabbits. We even have a bat and thrown in there. And I'm going to show you, for example, the types of data that she looked at. So here's an example of a bison. On the top, on the map, you can see these are the occurrence points for bison from 11,700 years ago to 4,200 years ago. And we translated that into what are the climates that were present at each one of these occurrence points. And so on the bottom, you can see that the shaded in area, those are the climates where bison were living during the post-glacial time period. And then that outline, that's showing you all of the climate that's available in the United States during that time period. So we did this for each of the 5 time periods, right? And so on the left, you can see the occurrence points through time. On the right, you can see how these climates where the species is living, how they have changed over time. And they have changed actually quite a bit over time. So what she was looking at was, what is the overlap from one time period to the next time period of these climates where these species are living, right? So if you look at the left panel here, what we're showing you is how much does the climate where the species are living change from one time period to the next time period. The blue time period is past climate, right? Is the past climate that the species lived in. The pink area is the present climate where the species is living. And you can see that if the species is shifted, what climate it's living in a lot, it would have very little overlap between those two climates. If it's shifted just a little bit, the climates in which it's living, the middle panel is correct. And then if it's hardly shifted the climate where it's living at all, you'll have very high overlap between these climates, right? And so when we look at this across time periods, what we end up seeing is that there's pretty good overlap between most time periods, except between European and industrial times. There's a really big shift in the climate that a bison lives in after Europeans arrive in North America. And when we then expand this out and look across all 46 of the mammal species, we see a really large shift at this time across all of these different species. So really dramatic shift in the climates where species are living. But we wanted to know, like, why is this, right? Is this actually humans? And so we asked the question, is it actually human land use that's driving the changes in the climates where mammals are living? And to do this, what we did was we just looked at the climates where urban, cropland, we did some others also, but where human impacted landscapes are found today. So what are the climates where we find croplands today in North America? And we said, okay, are species like avoiding the climates where we're planting crops, or are they expanding into the climates where we're planting crops, right? So again, it's the same type of diagram. Here's a species in the past. How much did it overlap with today's urban habitat, urban climates, right? So the urban climate never changes, that's today. So how much did it overlap in the past versus how much is it overlapping today? So in this case, what you're seeing is that species is shifting into the climates that are now occupied by urban habitats, right? And so this, we depict this with a yellow color in our figures. And this means that that species is expanding its climate into areas that are affected by humans. The opposite case can also happen, right? Where it used to live in climates where urban areas are now found, and it's moved away from those climates, right? In that case, we depict that color with a purple color. And so here's what we find. Is human land use driving changes in climates where mammals live? We find a full spectrum from yellow all the way to purple. And if you dig into that spectrum, what we see is that small mammals are expanding the climates where they're living to live more in areas with humans. And large mammals are shrinking the climates that they're living to avoid humans. This makes a lot of sense, but we can actually dig into each individual species and say, okay, so how much do they hate humans, right? How much do they want to avoid humans? And build this into our planning, right? So generally, that we actually know the individual species, right? Larger mammals are needing more help tracking climates than some of the smaller mammals. And if we think about what this means with respect to climate change and with respect to conservation planning, we can actually use some of this historical data in order to look at the individual rates that different plant biomes are going to transition, when and where they might transition, how they've transitioned in the past, and the extent to which different species, individual species, are going to be able to potentially track climate across the landscape when human impacted lands pop up as a barrier, right? And so going forward, conservation strategies have begun to shift. And so they've shifted away from this kind of very static perspective that really focuses on individual species and conserving individual species in a bubble, not really thinking about human impacts, thinking more about individual site management. And it started shifting to this dynamic perspective that's played out by in the paleontological record, in the record of dynamic responses that we see to environmental change over time. And so this is an example of some more dynamic perspective on conservation going forward. The Yellowstone to Yukon project's been going on for, I think, 15, 20 years, something like that, where they're really, instead of trying to predict where each individual species is going to need to shift in response to climate change, they're in fact trying to create an integrative landscape that will allow species to move in response to change in climate as they need to, right? So it's creating an integrated and connected landscape that is mirrored in kind of our perspective of how dynamic shifts are happen in response to changing climate. So with that, I want to again acknowledge Sylvia and Ray, whose work I talked about, our collaborators on the several different papers I talked about, and our funding sources. And then also the other members of our lab, these are my grad students, Ben, Julia, and Dan. And there's Rachel Short, who, as was mentioned earlier, also gave a presentation in the series, so you should look it up. If you have any questions for me, please feel free to email me or check out our website, mcguire.tech.edu.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm sure we have some questions coming in. I have a quick one. When we're looking at that map that shows the movement of species as climate changes, there really appears to be this sort of movement to the Appalachians and then northward in much of Eastern North America. And so does that mean that in some ways that we should expect even higher diversity for a while?
Well, so it's interesting. If you look at this map, it's true that the movement needs of species are up into the Appalachia, and the Appalachia serves as a sort of superhighway. The reason for that is because that's the only topographic diversity, right? The only elevational diversity, the only cold areas in the East. But if you compare that, let me see, to the maps of connectivity in the United States, what you'll actually see is that our landscapes are so fragmented that it might be really challenging for things to move here. And so one of the conservation priorities that people have been talking and thinking a lot about, and there's a new kind of aspirational map of connectivity for the Eastern United States, which folks should check out, Eastern Corridors, or Eastern Wildways, I think is what they're calling it. But the reality is that we really need a lot more connections through here in order for this superhighway vision, right, to be actually enacted. So yeah,
so
good question.
May have been much more of the case, but not necessarily today.
Yeah, this is where they need to move, not necessarily where they can,
yes.
where they can move. So yeah.
Josh and Chris, you have any?
Yeah,
I've got one.
Oh, go ahead, Josh. I'll go next.
Okay, so you're talking about connectivity here, and one of the things I was thinking about is the connectivity between different species. So species depending on certain food resources or avoidance of certain kinds of predators. I'm wondering if anybody working with you or elsewhere has been looking at that, because it's something where I think about the climate may not be driving the modern distribution. It might be some certain kind of predator. Like I think of beavers today don't live where alligators do. Or might it be a food resource that some kind of tree is what something needs to survive?
Yeah, the interspecific interaction side of things. We haven't been doing a lot of that, though there are, of course, other groups who are doing a lot of that. We've been looking at climate. So going forward, one of the things that we're looking at is climate tracking as kind of an innate characteristic of the species, though there's probably hidden covariates that are interspecific interactions, right? And we've been looking at this both in the plant side of things and the animal side of things. So maybe decade dream is to interact those two, but it is a long-term goal. It's hard to do everything at once. So keeping a close eye on the community distribution modeling and things like that, and some of the some of the ETE work, and then so no is the short answer. We haven't been doing much of it, but we know we should think about it.
So Jenny, all this stuff is really cool. It's really big picture, and you're dealing with climate change. You're dealing with many species that are changing kind of geographic range very rapidly. This idea of applying paleontological data to modern conservation, it's not particularly new. I mean, we've been thinking about it for 10, 15 years and starting to have some of those conversations. Are you starting to see, how is this being received by policymakers, by land managers and that sort of thing? Are they starting to really listen to the paleontological record in some of these things?
So yes, they take what they want is my answer. So I do go and present this work at conservation conferences. I've been really actively trying to maintain that side of my research program. And people are, some people are more skeptical than others, right? About the relevance and the impact. Those that are, but there are a lot of people who also are willing to embrace kind of the new ideas. One of the, for example, I'll give you an example, which is that one of the big implications that I didn't talk about here because I was trying to keep it on a public level, but the fact that these species have shifted their ranges, the climates where they live so much, right? This means that if we look at where these species are living today and try to predict where they can live in the future, right? We're not approximating their fundamental niche at all, right?
Yeah.
We're way underestimating, or in the case of some rodents, I don't know, maybe we're correctly estimating where they can live in the future, or what climates they can live in. And so this idea that like today's niche doesn't look like the fundamental niche of the species is something that initially my prior work where I said like transference of these models doesn't work well, right? And they said, oh, you're doing the models wrong. And then I said, look, now we have a mechanism for why transference of the models don't work. And then now people are like, oh, you're right. We do have to use physiological models instead of modern occurrence-based models. So, it's a gradual process as it is with anything, but it can be useful. And one of the things we're doing with this other project, the Residence Time project was inspired by some of Nature Conservancy's resilient landscapes work. And we've been working with them and talking with them about what does it mean for a landscape to be resilient, and does their perception of resilience play back in the fossil record? The answer is not yet, but they've been giving us some of their data, like their landscape data on like, what do we think are resilient landscapes, so that we can look at persistence through time and recovery. We actually also calculate recovery for this. So both residence time and recovery time, which are two components of resilience, and really try to figure out how our data interacts with their modern perception of what is a resilient landscape. So we talk to them. Sometimes they're different languages, but it's worthwhile, I think. So
yeah.
So getting at that, a question I had is thinking about that kind of idea of conserving what's there now is often what the focus is for land management agencies. So when I worked for the National Park Service, there was this kind of idea of this is the historical state of what this place is, and we need to conserve that. But your work is pointing to these as being really dynamic landscapes. And do you find people are thinking more about kind of resilience and dynamic landscape resilience rather than preserving some kind of ideal that they have?
Yes, but um, so I mean, there's a lot of challenges to that, right? And I've been talking to people about this a lot recently, actually, is that like, I think we need to take this bounce forward approach, right? So if let's say some landscape becomes degraded somehow, right? Its ecosystem function is no longer what it used to be. We should really take that as an opportunity to think about what future needs are for this space, and bounce forward in this space and as a broader landscape. The problem is, how exactly do you do that is hard. And when you're on the ground needing some in the moment answer, it's not super easy to convince somebody that like not to just do restoration back to the norm, right? Back to the previous state. I mean, not always. I mean, but the thing is, some people are really thinking that way, right? And people are thinking about where marsh systems are really important, right, going forward and things like that. So I think it just varies a lot. And I do think, I guess that late slide where I was talking about, shifts in perception, I think those are happening, as in any field, heterogeneously across the field, right? So shifts from this kind of more pure restoration landscapes to, more dynamic landscapes. It's happening. Yeah.
And I imagine people are thinking more about ecosystem functions. And
yes, there's
more.
Ecosystem function. So I think services are still there. They shifted a little more toward function and a little less from service. But yeah, what I was going to say is we're doing a symposium at ESA this year on how paleontology can inform restoration. So I'm going to pitch this and see how it goes.
We have a number of questions that are coming in on Facebook, and I'm going to read one off here by Greg McDonald, who's also done a Paleo Talks or two with us. Do you think rewilding will work? Can rewilding be done with small species as well as large species?
I get really anxious about the rewilding idea. I feel very torn about it. I think that paleontologists of all stripes are correct that like going forward, the only way that we're going to conserve megafauna is to rewild. I also know that the social side of that is such a huge hurdle that I don't know how conservation biologists are ever going to be able to get over it. And it's really unpopular in conservation biology as well. I think maybe it could work. It could lead to lots of minor disasters, or even potentially occasionally major disasters. And but also I don't know that it's ever going to become a reality in the time frame that it needs to become a reality.
I can't think of very many examples where rewilding has occurred with smaller species like rodents, except for maybe prairie dogs and that sort of situation. But
invasions, beavers, right? They did beaver rewilding in the West, and it was great. But I mean, that was true that was reintroduction, not rewilding in the way that we often talk about rewilding, right? Of like moving something from another continent to North America.
I also think that time since things were extirpated is important. So the beavers were only gone for maybe 200 years in these places, not thousands.
Right,
that's right.
Right. Yeah, moving from far away seems like a bad idea. It may work.
I don't know that. I mean, it may work. I don't know that it'll ever actually happen because there's going to be so much resistance.
David, do you want to loop in some more questions?
Sure, we've got some more here in the comments. Jenny in the comments asks, Has it been tracked which geological areas could possibly become future refuges conserving pickier species, either plants or animals?
So, I mean, as you guys said, my work is on a really broad scale. Most conservation biology is on a smaller scale, right? And so a lot of work has been done on individual species and individual plants and individual ecosystems, trying to evaluate a lot of detail about them and exactly, what are their ecological needs. And I don't want to discount that research because there's so much out there. And in fact, that we often aren't integrating, right? And then I would love to integrate more. So I would say that yes, people have done it for very specific taxa. Like if you go look up, what's the name of the Western grouse that's has been studied to absolute death, right? You can look up sage grouse. You will find, you will know every single tiny detail about how often they breed and what day each one breeds, right? So you'll know every detail about the habitats they want to live in and their ability to breed, reproduce, and potentially survive going forward. Although that component is more recent, right? People have been thinking about that for the last 10, 15 years more. But yeah, so yes, for some species that is definitely known.
Okay. Thanks for that answer. We've got another question here from our friend and yours, Aaron, who asks, could hunting pressure be impacting the shifts between European arrival and the industrial period more so than climate, particularly for larger taxa?
Maybe. We don't, so we don't explicitly, what we look at, so we don't quite look at, we don't say that climate is what's causing this. We say that it's probably human impacted landscapes. And the climates that they're shifting away from, oh, sorry, that's a slide with a billion transitions. I'll just go to that one. The climates that they're shifting away from are ones that overlap with where lots of humans are. The mechanism for why that is, whether it's because we planted a crop here, a giant agricultural field here, or because the farmers are killing everything that comes onto those agricultural fields, you can't distinguish between those two mechanisms, right? So all we're showing is pattern. They're shifting away from places where we now have croplands, but not necessarily the reason for that. So.
Gotcha. Thanks for that question, Aaron. We've got another one here from Mason, who asks, can these data be used in the opposite direction to model how paleoclimate changes might have caused biogeographic changes?
You mean paleoclimate changes may have caused biogeographic?
So I think the question is, whereas you're trying to model these changes in the relatively recent past to interpret what's going to happen in the future, can you also use these data to compare with even older things to say, are we seeing similar patterns in the past?
Yeah, so there's a lot of question around it's called paleo species distribution modeling, deep time species distribution modeling, that kind of thing. The idea is that if you're thinking about, here's the climates where I think things can survive, and here's the climates where they existed in the past, and how do those interact, right? I'd say that you can do it as long as you feel pretty confident of a couple of things. One is that you actually know the climates where the species can live, right? So you really are assessing the niche of the species. Three things. Two, you think that the interspecific interactions haven't been so wildly different in the past that that might nudge them into a really different realized niche at that time period than you might have today. And three, that you don't think a lot of evolution has occurred of the climates where that species can survive, right? So, I mean, one thing that can happen if you're looking back 6 million years ago, right? A species 6 million years ago probably is a bit different than the species as it is today. Maybe not. I mean, right? But it's possible that it's adapted in situ to climate changes that have occurred. And if that's the case, if it no longer has a different amount of variance in how much climate it can survive in, then your predictions aren't going to be incredibly accurate. So.
All right, we've got one more question from the audience here, and then I've got a question I'd like to ask after that. Grant asks, one of the first models you showed of species movement adapting to climate change didn't seem to have much data for amphibians in the Western states. Why is that?
There are. So you can see a few little amphibians over here. The reality is the reason that it looks so yellow in the east is that the southeast is a biodiversity hotspot for amphibians. I always get this question about this map. And you can see also all of these species, given projected climate change, are needing to shift pretty uniformly and pretty far. In the west, you can see there are some little amphibian species. There's tiny little dots here. They're not needing to shift a lot. Actually, never really noticed that part that much, but it's a matter of numbers. So it's just more biodiversity in the east, and so it gets swamped relative to other taxa.
All right, and then I have a question that I'd like to ask. One of the things that I think is so interesting about this kind of research compared to a lot of paleontology research is that you're looking at things that are a lot of it happening today and directly applicable to what's going on today and to human activity and human experience. And so your presentation started with the 6th mass extinction, and you are professionally thinking about these questions of extinction and human impact all the time. What is that like for you as a person? What is the impact on you to be a person who is constantly thinking about these questions of the state of the world and what's going to happen in the future? Is it depressing? Do you have lots of reason to be encouraged? What's sort of the human angle of that?
Couple things. I try not to dwell on it too much. One. Two, I feel constantly at odds. And here's what I feel at odds about. One is that I did come from a geologist perspective, a deeper time perspective, let's say. And in a really long time frame, things usually bounce back and, right? Like things will re-equilibrate over millions of years. Everything will be okay, right? Mm-hmm. The problem is on the human time scale, next generation, 2 generations, 3 generations, that might not be so cool, right? And it's not, I mean, biodiversity worries me. I actually think plants and animals are perhaps more, and I use this in the like purely psychological context, more resilient than we give them credit for sometimes. I think that we'll have, decreased biodiversity, especially anything we can easily hunt. But I think that overall, some biodiversity is a bit resilient. The thing that actually makes me really worried is whether or not human ingenuity can keep up with human resources. So just like on the human time scale, it's more about like what we're doing to ourselves than what we're doing to the world that really bothers me and that I really try to avoid thinking too hard about. My colleagues at Georgia Tech, there's so many engineers here, tell me they think we can keep up the innovation. Innovation is progressing fast enough that we'll figure it out. I feel pretty worried about that. So
Yeah, that makes sense. You're on the sort of on the front lines of worrying about these kinds of things when it comes to conservation and thinking about the future in longer timescales than what I think that the average person is really considering. So I always think it's interesting to hear what that is like for the people doing it. So thanks for sharing that. I appreciate it.
Yeah, very good question, and thank you for that insightful answer. I think quaternary paleontologists, probably more than other paleontologists, have this sort of weight on their shoulders looking at distributional changes and extinctions that includes humans in near time. Yeah, and there is this weight that we carry. So yeah, good answer. Thank you. I saw Josh really nodding his head when he was talking about being depressed.
Well, some of us have small children and think about what might be happening in future decades. What world will they face in the future?
Mm-hmm. And I think another part of it, though, that is so different from so much of other paleontology is that aspect of having to sell this science to the people that are going to potentially make the changes. Yeah.
that's what's so exciting about it too.
It is exciting. That's right. That's right. So thanks for carrying
We can have real world impact.
Yeah, yeah. It's so applicable. So thank you again. This has been wonderful.
Great. That was fun. Thanks for having me.
David, you want to wrap it up?
Sure. Thanks to everybody who asked questions. Thanks to everyone for participating, for asking questions, for joining us today. We'll be back again soon. We've got a bunch of other guests lined up. And
actually, we're looking at Ice Age extinctions of India next week. So,
oh, that'll be fun. And then, of course, thanks again to Jenny for joining us. This was a really exciting talk.
All right. Thank you all.